Yeah, what we are looking at today is the test for cube, then your slump test. We want to do comparison between these concrete tests. The both tests are for concrete. Yes, and both the cube test and the slump test. But it's just that one is for dried concrete. That is when you have your concrete cube, while the other one is for wet concrete. So cube test, that is for compressive strength, while the slump test is for workability of the concrete. So for cube test, it determines the compressive strength of hardened concrete. So you cast your concrete in a cube, then once it hardens, you start doing your test. But for slump test, it is done you know on site, on your concrete. Like once you are done with mixing your concrete, you perform the slump test to determine the workability or consistency of fresh concrete. So you can see the cube. It is 150 millimeter by 150 millimeter by 150 millimeter. So the height is 150, the width is 150, and so on and so forth. So the purpose of both cube tests and slump test. So if you want to check the purpose for the cube test is to check the strength of hardened concrete. That is for the cube test. So we are trying to make comparison. Then the purpose for the slump test is to check the workability or fluidity of fresh concrete. So slump test is for fresh concrete, while the cube test is for hardened concrete. So the type of tests, for cube test, we have destructive test, because at the end of the day, the concrete is going to be destroyed. That means you're going to destroy the cube. But for the slump test, it is non-destructive, right? Because as you are done with the test, you can still make use of the concrete, the fresh concrete that you've tested, with the slump apparatus. Then time of test. So we are going to look at the time, consider the time of test. So for the cube test, it is done after 7 days. That means once you cast the concrete and the concrete has hardened for 7 days, you do the test. Then 14 days, you do the test. Then 28 days of casting, you still perform the test, so you can compare between 7, 14, and 28. Then for the slump test, you perform the test at the time of concreting. That is at the time of concreting. That means once you have mixed your concrete, so you can just perform the test, right? Or at the point of delivery. That means when you're pouring the concrete into, maybe you're casting your slab, so you can just take a portion of the mixed concrete to just perform the slump test. So then the sample, for the sample, we have a cube which is 150 mm by 150 mm by 150 mm. That is your concrete cubes. That you're going to have multiple cubes that you've casted, right? That you're going to use for your compressive compressive strength test. That is your cube test, right? But for the slump test, all you just need is a fresh concrete in slump cone. So you can see the cone. So all you just need just to measure the freshly mixed concrete and put it into your cone for the test. Then the equipment that are being used for the cube test, we are going to be using a compressive testing machine, because after the cube has hardened, it is that compressive testing machine that helps you to determine the compressive strength of concrete in that cube. Then you're going to make use of the tamping rod. Then you're going to make use of the mold, which will help you to get the shape of the cube. Then the weighing balance to actually know the weight of your cube. But for slump test, you just need your slump cone, right? The slump cone, then the tamping rod, then scale, measuring tape, then flat base plate. So the materials or equipment for slump test is easily gotten on site, so it's not something that is difficult to get. The only thing is for you to get your cone, then your tamping rod, scale, then measuring tape, flat base plate, then the result. So we're also going to juxtapose the result between compressive strength and the workability test. So and for the result, you can see in the end you're going to have the compressive strength at the other side. Then at the other side you're going to have the slump value in millimeters. But for compressive stress, it's going to be Newton per millimeter square. But for the slump test, it's just going to be in millimeters. Then what are these tests used for? Because you actually need to understand what the compressive strength test is used for, and also what the slump test is used for. So for the compressive strength test, it is to ensure the concrete meets the required strength. So the cubes are actually concrete, so you need to check the required strength. Even in buildings, maybe you've casted your columns, your beam, your slab, so you need to know the required strength of such concrete structure. Then for the slump test, it is to ensure the concrete has good workability for placement. So the essence of slump test is just for you to ensure that the concrete is good, and it's going to give you a good workability for your placement. Then the importance, so also check the importance between the cube test and the slump test. So for the cube test, it indicates the quality and load bearing capacity of hardened concrete. So it helps you to actually place rightly the quality and load bearing capacity of the hardened concrete. Then for the slump test, it helps in placing, compacting and finishing the concrete easily. So both the finishing, the compaction, and placing, there is a placement of concrete easily. So all this, when you put them together, it helps you to actually get the best comparison between your cube test and the slump test.